All right, good day and welcome to the Attachment Network of Manitoba's podcast, Reframing Addiction, the Crisis of Disconnection. My name is Michael Redhead Champagne and I will be your host for today. And I'm very excited to be joined by a very special guest.
Eldon Dueck. I'm a long-term educator and started my career off as a youth pastor and then became a teacher and followed that through to being a resource teacher and counselor, and then finally a principal of a school. And that's how I ended my career about 4 or 5 years ago. And since then, I keep getting hired back for half-time positions to help work with struggling youth and kids who don't meet their attendance requirements. So that's been my job and really love it.
That's amazing. It's really fantastic to have you here. As we've been hosting different voices on reframing addiction, the crisis of disconnection, we're trying to get to our purpose of the podcast series, which is basically exploring addiction and healing through the lens of trauma and disconnection. So as communities have become more and more disconnected from healthy relationships with families, friends, communities, even themselves, addictions have become also more widespread in our lives. So we're defining trauma as the lack of safety, connection, and healthy relationships. The crisis of disconnection is a trauma that we are facing in our communities, families, and friendships, and we will be exploring how that trauma of disconnection impacts addiction. We're going to be answering the question of how we can reconnect in ways to assist those individuals, families, and communities that are in the struggle and on the road on their healing journey. So we're going to jump right into it by asking the question of, from your perspective, what does addiction look like in Manitoba, and how has the landscape of addiction changed over the last 10-ish years, which is great, I think, because you'll have some of that time when you were active as administrator and then some of your quotation retired time. And I'll basically just give a shout out to you before we get started and say that I appreciate the work that you do supporting students. And like a lot of the folks in my circle, they don't know what retirement is either. So anyway, apologies, but last 10 years, what have you been seeing and how have things changed?
Well, I might go back just a little further, over a few decades, because when I started in the high school system, I noticed that there was a much greater consumption of alcohol, actually, and it wasn't uncommon to find somebody either having just come to school, having had too much to drink at lunch, or having someone fall off the choir bleachers at a concert because they were, playing with alcohol, so to speak. And so there was an easily detectable kind of a drug that students were using. But I began to notice that there was a shift towards drugs, and I believe that a large part of that has to do with the fact that there's a different buzz that's associated with drugs than there is with alcohol. And so because alcohol was easily, something you could smell, first of all, and would really impair them, it became something that was a bit more hidden and secretive. And I noticed that was a real spike in about the last 10 years. And the kids that are really high on something like meth, that's very obvious, but the marijuana field has really become impacting. And I see that being a big issue. And I think two of the changes in our society with weed or marijuana is that there's a medicinal value which is prescribed, and so there's a real tendency for youth to justify their use of it. Like, oh, well, the doctors can prescribe it, and it's really good for me. It's good for my mom or my grandpa, and so it really isn't that bad a thing for me to do it. So that shift has really moved forward as well, because when students who use marijuana and use it, I would going to say moderately, they find that it also calms them down and there's some relief to their anxiety and some of their stress. So they believe in the medicinal value. So it's that much easier to justify. But they don't quite get the fact that their young minds aren't doing that well with it. The second part is that since it's been legalized, there's an even greater sense of, well, I'm just 2 years away from 18 and it'll be legal then. So it's really not that big a deal. And of course, there are so many places that are growing it for their own use. And so in that purpose environment, they also sell it. So it's much more accessible, in my opinion. And it's not that secretive thing that happens way out in the back corner of the schoolyard so much as it did, about a decade or so ago. And what once was more of a weekend party kind of a drug system is now much more of I would say, a daily use by the kids that are pursuing it. So I think that's really been a huge part of the change. And I think there's a growing thought among young people. And as recent as just a few months ago, a student told me on the phone, but Mr. Dueck, I can control my use. I'm good. I can manage it. And marijuana is more controllable than the harsher drugs. So I know that there's that mindset as well. And the other thing is, the problem is that the students or the young people or the teens are not aware of how easy the transition goes to the harder drugs, the more harsh drugs from marijuana. So, and I don't know whether vaping plays into that as much. I'm not that good on the statistics of that, but definitely, marijuana takes that edge off, but I want to try a little more. So that I think is another change that's happened over the last 10 years.
The comments that you actually just shared really remind me of the Icelandic approach to reducing the onset of harmful substance use amongst youth. And so what they basically did in Iceland, and the primary substance at that time was alcohol that they were dealing with. And through an approach that included like a lot of data, right? A lot of numbers, but also increased recreation, increased involvement with parents and support networks, and a couple other elements, they were able to reduce the onset of problematic substance use amongst young people from age 14 to age 16. And I know some people think that that's not that big of a deal, but I would be wondering if you think that that is something that we maybe could learn and apply here.
Absolutely. I mean, to think for 1 minute that that age group and that vulnerability of that age group can't be impacted would be ludicrous, because I love the model you're talking about. But yes, definitely. In fact, one of the things I'm going to interject it already, I really believe in the drug abuse resistance education program. You know it as DARE. And they offer it in grade 6. And as a principal, I made every effort I could to raise money for it to happen in my school. Also really supported it in the community. I don't know why we're not doing it in grade 10. Like, we do it once in grade 6. That's at a pivotal point. But when you get a little older, like you're talking 14 to 16, that's another impactful way. And of course, it'd have to be changed up to meet that age group. But I think that's a significant program that could be used in similar to what you're talking about with the Icelandic approach. Like, I should get someone to write up a really current teen approach to grade 10, and it should be part of our curriculum there, except for level 2.
Hey, maybe one of the listeners of the podcast will hear our dare and take us up on it.
I like it. I might even take the challenge myself.
Here we go, right? Like, why wait? Whenever you say somebody should do something, you're probably the somebody.
Oh.
I'm so pleased with the things that you're sharing, and I'm so happy that you have so many experiences with students, but also with schools. And I wonder, what's the relationship between trauma and addictions?
Oh, wow. I really struggled with this question, Michael. I I've got all these great things written down, and you know, I am a real firm believer in how much trauma impacts children and young teens, and even up to young adulthood. And it's just the perfect setting for kids to look for a solution to reduce their pain and suffering. And so I think that we often as adults don't think that something is as traumatic as it is. And so we're kind of like, everybody goes through a tough spot. So, we treat that a little bit too lighthearted, in my opinion, in the education world. So I'm a firm believer that when a kid says they've experienced trauma, and of course we know that through counseling, they have experienced it.
And believe people?
and often we discredit their concern. And so I think we treat it a little bit too lighthearted. And I mean, that is the big push for kids to pursue drugs and some way to reduce and take care of the pain. It's not a great solution, but that's what they see. And I mean, I think that's second to the other idea of the thrill-seeking part. There are some students that just get involved with friends who get them talked into it, and they become marginalized in a group that would be, sort of more status quo. And then they shift over to the group that's trying to cover their pain. And that group looks like they're kind of cool and they're having fun. And of course, you know this better than many of us, how much that kind of a drug using group embraces marginalized kids. And then you become part of a group and you get stronger, but part of that expectation is that you become a user yourself. And I am just beginning to think and realize even more deeply that the examples that some of our stressed, traumatized youth face is the drawing card of having had older siblings who've been in trouble, uncles, aunts, parents, extended family, friends. And they've seen and I just am working with a couple of cases now where, well, my dad got through it. He went through really hard times, and my uncle got through it, and even my grandpa got through it. Now look, they're fine, so I'll be fine. And so there's that whole thing, of that kind of a connection as well. And I think the main thing is that when they experience trauma, either themselves or see it happen to people they love, they immediately reach out for a solution. And this is the main way that they see of resolving it. But I do think that the examples of others, having been there and been involved, I think that really is a drawing card as well.
So I wonder about educators. Do you think educators do a good job of addressing the root causes to addiction?
That's here's the thing. The DARE program is sort of that program that gets parachuted in, and it's done by police officers, and there's some value in that. I don't think we have enough of this issue in our curriculum in health. And I have to be a little bit careful how I say that, but
of course.
I really think that we need, what we tend to do as a society, Michael, is we bring in specialists. So we bring in AFM counselors, and of course that's voluntary. We bring in mental health workers, and that's voluntary. We bring in social workers, and that's voluntary, like for kids to participate. So I think I really am going back to that DARE program. We need to be more active with the external kind of courses that we can offer in schools. And I don't know where the right advocacy is for that, but as teachers, we teach our curriculum, and I mean, if there might be a short section on drug use and abuse, but how often do we really review it? And so then the minute we see somebody struggling, we try to bring in a specialist. So I think schools need to, or I should say not schools, because teachers are willing and ready, even though it's one more thing.
I feel like teachers do an amazing job.
Yes.
They do a great job responding, but I just wonder from that like larger kind of school perspective, right? Like what should the schools be doing to support those teachers? Because I know that the in my own experience, the value of teachers reaching out and being able to, make connections with students really helps. And so I just see schools as such a vehicle for good.
You've got it. I'd say amen, but that would sound religious. And I'm just going to say yes. And teachers are willing, and teachers care deeply. And I get daily referrals to me from teachers who are concerned about students. And even if it's not, sort of drug use, they know something's going on and that child needs some special attention. So I just noticed, though, that as a society, we parachute in professionals and specialists, and I'm wondering what could be done a little more with curricular interjection. So,
just build it right in. Just build it right into the curriculum. And
again, maybe here I'm pointing the finger back at myself. Maybe I'm volunteering for another thing.
Well, okay, so I don't know if you would agree with this statement that addiction has become an epidemic in our communities or not. Would you say yes or no?
I struggle with whether it's an epidemic.
I brought up the little definition just to share it because it helps me understand too. A widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time.
I definitely think that there are communities that have much more of the epidemic quality in it. I really believe, though, at the same time that starting with DARE in grade 6, I have seen remarkable results from that program. So I think that DARE and our health curriculum that teachers dedicated to teaching have done so much for more kids. What I'm going to say is that I believe that there are more kids who are the typical drug use oriented students who are using more and the harder drug and more often. So then it feels like it's an epidemic when there's maybe 30 kids out of 1,800 that are really hard users. There might still be another 50 to 100 that are marginal users out of 1,800 students, like in the school I work in. But I'm not always so sure that it's at epidemic proportions, but what I am sure about is that there are more kids using it more often and more harshly.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And so how have you seen, speaking of things that are large spread, how have you seen COVID-19 affect addictions in the students that you work with?
Well, there's definitely been one problem. You and I can do this Zoom thing and feel good about it and go, oh, this is great technology. But this number of students that I've tried to connect with our AFM counselor or our social workers and then have to try to arrange a Zoom connection has not been as successful as I'd hoped it would be. I know that there are quite a few that have been very successful, and I'm not sure why some students respond nicely to it, but that has taken the personal, hey, how are you? It's good to see you stuff in the hallway is really impacting our world. And I know through this past year, we went through a really tough time as a school with an unexpected passing of one of our students. And I would say that loss of connection with the face-to-face is a big factor, Michael. And yes, COVID has impacted that. But I think I want to challenge our society. Like, how many of us really adopted somebody, another family, a neighbor, somebody that we knew is, eliciting signs of concern? My wife and I have tried to really get involved at several levels where we say, hey, we can't just sit in our own nice little house and sit by the fire and watch TV. We have to connect with other people that we know are struggling. And I think as a society, we need to do a bit more of that. But I'll tell you, if there is a family that's already struggling with finances or, dealing with issues at home, and then with COVID restrictions, their finances are affected, their physical abuse factor goes up, the emotional abuse goes up, violence goes up, sexual abuse goes up. So the opportunity for trauma has increased exponentially. And so if we as neighbors and friends aren't caregiving to people that we know are already stretched, then we are just allowing this to get more widespread. So yes, COVID has had an impact, and if they already have trauma, they tend to feel darker about life. So yes, it leans towards more drug use or even suicide.
And so I really love what you're saying. It really brings a simplicity to what must be done, by saying, like, let's just, be friends and neighbors and like take care of the people around us. Really, I think the answers sometimes are that simple when we're trying to address disconnection. It's like, be a human being.
That's what you did with Meet at the Bell Tower, I think is what you call it. It's like, okay, we keep talking. Okay, forget it. We're going to go to the tower at 5:00 on Friday. Yeah. And that's what begins to make a difference. And in our case, we chose to keep specific contact with certain individuals and families that we said we're really committed to this. And it's a simple solution. You're right.
Yeah, 100%. And so I wonder, we've talked about kind of individuals and a little bit about what maybe the broader community can do as well. But what do you think if we were doling out a recipe for a healthy community? What ingredients do we gotta put in the cake?
Okay, which question are you kind of on here, brother? Because I got lots of stuff here, and I need to know where you are.
I'm making stuff up because I'm just listening to the conversation here.
Okay.
And so basically, what I'm looking for here is the third last question.
Okay.
Of what do we need for a sense of healthy community? What would healthy community resources look like?
Well, I really believe in drop-in centers. I really believe in volunteer experiences. I believe in mentorship. I believe in nonprofit organizations that are trying to make a difference. And I think that they have to jump through way too many hoops to get their status so that they're able to be a charitable organization. And so even in the case of middle school, we have our middle school kids dealing with, helping out and volunteering with seniors. And I'm thinking, well, why are seniors not volunteering and working with kids? We have a lot to offer. And I mean, that's why I keep going back half time. Now, the reason I like being in a school is because I've got a confined audience. And when you're referred to me, I go after you. My son and I do seminars, and we call that RPR instead of CPR, the Relentless Pursuit of Relationship.
Oh, I love that. That is so good.
That's it, man. We need to pursue people, and we need to pursue relationships. And I think we tend to squirrel away in our own little comfort zones, and we feel like, oh, I could never do that. I could never help that person. Oh, that's too much. It's too much stress. Yes, there is stress involved in it. but I think we need to have drop-in centers, and we have a really fantastic drop-in center here in our town. I think that we need to. I think we need to be a little bit more mandatory. I have to say, our superintendent some years ago, when we had an AFM program going really strong in our school, he set up a system where he said, if you have a student that's going to get suspended for drug use, and let's say it might be 10 days, I'm making that number up. But if the student and the parent agree to meet sort of in a mandatory way with the AFM worker for 5 times, we'll reduce the sentence by 5 days. You get what I'm saying? I mean, that can vary. Well, there are people that got up in arms, not AFM, but people are like, well, we can't be mandatory to this stuff. And I've said, well, if you get too many demerits on your license for driving, guess what? You got to go to a mandatory class in the evening about how to drive. And we don't have enough parent seminars. My cousin does a great job on a program called Drug Proof Your Kids. He says, we offer this program over and over again. And the most he's ever had show up is maybe 2 or 3 parents, maybe 5 at the most, because they're embarrassed, they're shy, they're concerned. And I sometimes think we need to wield a bigger punch to mandatory, kind of, well, everybody says you can't do that because voluntary stuff doesn't work. If they're not willing and agreeable, it's not going to help. It's wrong. It does. And so I really think that some of the things that we've got going, like your organizations, we've got Teen Challenge that I think is really good. And we need to continue those programs and make it easier for them to set up when they're nonprofits.
Thank you very much. That's perfect. That leads us into the next question of shout outs. Are there any grassroots organizations that are doing anything new to help people on their healing journeys? Any people you want to give love to?
Well, I definitely love something that in our community here, we've got Eldad Ranch doing an amazing thing. We've got Backstage, our drop-in center here in town, that are just doing amazing work. And we've got volunteers coming out of the woodwork to help out with kids. And I mean, those are 2 of the organizations that just jump out. And I know I've dealt with teens from our community who have gone through Teen Challenge as well. And I just love what those 3 organizations do. I just think it's awesome. And of course, there are many. I mean, how many are you involved in, Michael?
A number. 1 or 2.
You're involved in a lot.
It's true. That's because there's a lot of good people doing a lot of good stuff. And kind of the whole point of our conversation here is that connection point. And so if I can help to connect, sounds like you do the same kind of stuff, connecting people to the supports that they need. And I think those are some 3 very, very special organizations that do fantastic work. Thank you for shining a light on what they do. So the last question is my favorite question because it's the dream section. If money was not a problem, what kind of changes would you want to see happen today?
I really think that we need to set up a system where we actually offer courses and give credit for it. Parents are struggling. Like I get invited to work with parent groups, and again, they don't want to attend very often because they're embarrassed. That might mean that they're struggling with their parenting. But if there was some kind of a parenting strategy, organization, group that says we're offering these courses, and I'm sure when I read through Attachment Network, I know that they've got all kinds of great things, but I don't know how to get people there. And so that's why I think if there's some way of providing something mandatory, when when a judge sees a young teen several times, and she or he can tell that the parent and the teen are struggling, look, what would be wrong with assigning them to some kind of a parenting strategy course? And I know that this is long before your time, but in the 70s, when I was a young man growing up in the city, we worked with kids at that time called juvenile delinquents. And we had a nonprofit organization that was called Lifeline. And the judge would assign the child to us and say, you have to meet with somebody from the organization so many weeks of the year or whatever it was. And though we were a nonprofit, we were able to connect with that child and his family. And I mean, then there was, similar to us, there was Big Brothers and Big Sisters, and I know that they're a powerful organization. I'm not sure how much where they're at right now in our country, but I remember I would get assigned a list of juvenile delinquents to follow up, and I would go to their homes and I would meet with them and their families, and I would take these guys out for coffee. I would do stuff with them, and we would complete. Let's say the judge said you have to do 10 weeks of meetings with Lifeline, and at the end of those 10 weeks, those kids continued in our program. Almost, I don't know what the percentage, it was huge. And there are still guys out there today that I know are doing well because of the judge saying you've got to attend those kinds of sessions. So that's kind of my thought. I don't know how that works. It's very government. Probably might be a lot of people disagreeing with me, but I think we need to direct people. Hey, when you're in trouble, you've got to go somewhere. If you just leave it to, well, if you want to go there, this would be a good idea. So you can tell I'm a little bit old school maybe in some way.
Hey, I love the proactive approach of just making those supports and services available and building that relationship with people before the bad thing happens, so that, you know, the connection is there. We're supposed to be reframing addiction, addressing the crisis of disconnection on this podcast. And I think that's exactly what you just hit the nail on the head. And so I want to give you an opportunity. If there's anything that I haven't asked you or anything else you'd like to share before we finish. This has been such a great conversation, and I really appreciate the work that you do.
Well, I just want to go back to something that I don't know exactly how to say this, Michael, but we tend to think that if we send a child or a teen, even a young adult, to a counselor, the counselors are really well trained and they're great. And they kind of say, okay, I've heard you say this. Here's my response to you. Here's a couple of things you can work on. But I think families kind of fall back a bit and they say, well, the counselor is working with my child, or other extended family members or support workers kind of go, well, the counselor's got that. You know, the counselor can't do it alone, Michael. And we need to quit thinking in that form. It's a bit delusional, I think, that somehow just by sending somebody to a counselor, they're going to get to the work. The counselors are doing their job and they've got great stuff, but who's walking beside the kid or the parent to move them further on their journey? You need somebody else to kind of say, like, I'm kind of your big brother, like the counselor, you don't have to tell me what you're talking about, but, you know, how can I help you get to do the things that the counselor has suggested to you? That's my big thing.
Yeah, well, hey, I love it because it's such a human being and like a family oriented approach, and it really resonates strongly with me. So thank you very much. I think that's the definition of healthy attachment that we're trying to get at.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Eldon, for being our special guest on our podcast. You have yourself a fantastic day.
Thank you very much, Michael. Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you too, Kathleen.
It's a pleasure.